Hello, everybody. So as you said, my name is Laurie, and I have been a web developer for 22 years, and currently I am the COO and co-founder of NPM Inc. Per Mazi's question, raise your hand if you've heard of NPM before. Cool. How many of you before tonight knew that we were a company? There we go. It's about half. That's why we are doing this, is we're trying to get the word out. So I'm going to talk very quickly about JavaScript in the enterprise and what doing JavaScript professionally means in 2018. It means modularity with easy discovery. It means frictionless workflows. It means vulnerability management and strong access control and compliance. But before I tell you about it, you should ask, why should you care? Or more importantly, why should your company care? And the answer is because JavaScript is important. Obviously, this is a JavaScript meetup, so that's not a particularly controversial statement, but even people who work in JavaScript, I think, are unaware of quite how big a deal JavaScript has become in the last few years, and I really want to drive that home. There are 10 million developers using NPM every day these days, and they download 8 billion packages every 7 days. And average Tuesday is about 1.5 billion packages downloaded. Obviously, that kind of growth is amazing. This is 19,500% growth, which is a number I love to trot out, since 2014. But in context, it's even more amazing. We went and we manually checked the websites of the Fortune 50, and all 50 of them are using NPM for something in production. The real challenging one was Berkshire Hathaway's website. Berkshire Hathaway has a website that's like HTML2 with like font tags. But one of their subsidiaries uses NPM in production, so we checked the box. All 50 of the 50 biggest financial firms, all 50 of the 50 biggest tech companies use NPM in production. And of the Fortune 500, every single one that we've checked, we haven't manually checked all 500, are using NPM in production so far. JavaScript is the most popular language on GitHub for 5 years running now. In Stack Overflow's survey of developers, it's the most popular language. Third-party surveys like Slashdata's global survey also put us first. And NPM is the biggest library of open source of any kind by a significant margin. All this means together that about 60% of programmers of any kind working in the world today are using JavaScript, even if it's not their primary language, and more than 90% of them are using NPM. Another fun fact is that in GitHub's 2018 State of the Octoverse summary, which they just put out last week, JavaScript was the #1 language, as it has been for a while, but it was also the #7 language, because the #7 language is TypeScript, which is a variant of JavaScript. So JavaScript appears twice in the top 10 somehow. TypeScript is exploding in popularity right now. Jason mentioned just a minute ago that putting OpenFin's type description into VS Code will help you write your code faster. And that's one of the things that is really driving the adoption of TypeScript. It's very popular with big teams. We surveyed 16,000 NPM users at the beginning of this year and discovered that 46% of them are using TypeScript for something, which is a really astonishing adoption rate for what is essentially a testing framework. So if you're in the 54% not using it right now, now might be a good time to start thinking about investigating it. The next thing to know is where JavaScript is being used. JavaScript is obviously being used to build front-end web applications. 93% of NPM's users are doing that. 70% are also doing back-end Node.js applications. But people are also writing a large number of mobile apps, both mobile web apps and mobile native apps in JavaScript. The entire sort of field of IoT has a huge number of SDKs in JavaScript. And all of these people are using NPM to do that. NPM has become the package manager for all of JavaScript, which is not what we were planning when we were putting together, a package manager for Node in 2009. But in particular, NPM has become indispensable for putting together web apps, rich web apps. 97% of the code in a modern rich web application is downloaded from NPM. Your developers are responsible only for the final 3%. All of those people you hire and all of the work that they do is the last 3% that makes your application different from all of the other React applications. Hands up if you're using React. Right, that's about right. 60% of NPM users report that they are using React. 40% of you are about to put your hands up. How many of you are using Angular? There we go. That's the breakdown between those two. And there's maybe 10 or 15% using Vue and a few other things like that. JavaScript has become, for better or worse, the most important programming language in the world, and that is a really strange and bold thing for me to stand up and say in front of a crowd. This is not what we were planning when we were doing form validation in 1996. This was not the strategy that we put in place. And in fact, it might not have been the language that we'd picked. If we were picking a language to be the lingua franca of programming, we might not have picked JavaScript, but it's here now, and there's nothing we can do about it, except apparently adopt TypeScript. And NPM has become central to JavaScript. But I still haven't answered that question I asked, which is, why should you care? And the answer is because 10 or even 5 years ago, JavaScript didn't matter. You had maybe 5 developers who were writing HTML and CSS and maybe a little bit of jQuery, and it wasn't crucial to what you were doing. But now, large businesses have hundreds of people doing nothing but building rich web applications or building Electron apps that are essentially rich web applications in a frame. And you're spending tons of money on JavaScript, and you're generating an enormous amount of IP in JavaScript. And in other languages that are used to that magnitude in the enterprise, there are professional tools that go along with that stuff, right? People are monitoring what's going on, they're tracking quality, they're tracking performance, and there's tools to make sure that you're getting ROI for all of these people that you're employing to write those languages for you. But the JavaScript world hasn't really caught up to that yet. Big companies are only just sort of realizing that this is a thing that they need to do. And part of the reason for that is because of that growth curve I showed you. 5 years ago, JavaScript was basically nowhere in terms of adoption relative to where it is now. Now it is this huge deal. And enterprises are not used to acting that fast. A 5-year change is a very rapid pace of adoption, especially in the world of finance. So it's well past time to start professionalizing the way that we do JavaScript. But what does that mean? It means getting systematic about it. It means wrapping some processes around it to achieve 2 goals. First, you want to ship quickly by using modular JavaScript effectively and by making it easy to discover without disrupting existing developer workflows. And second, you want to ship safely by controlling access to your code, by detecting vulnerabilities in your code, and ensuring compliance. Let's dig a little bit deeper into those. Modular JavaScript is key to shipping quickly, and if you needed an existence proof of that, you just need to look at the popularity of NPM itself. The reason that NPM is exploding in popularity is because people really love not having to write any code and just sharing it from other people. But there's a really relevant study here that I tell people about all the time by a guy called Leo Myrovich at UC Berkeley about how people choose programming languages. He did a whole PhD about this, it turns out. He studied all of the factors that went into choosing a programming language. How do you decide what language you're going to use for a project? Is it the language speed? Is it the features? Is it efficiency? Is it the fact that your company is already using this language? And he discovered that the most important factor is, are there open source libraries available that already do the thing that I need to get done? Over and above all other factors going into the choice of a language, that is what drove the adoption of JavaScript. In fact, that is what drives the adoption of any programming language. Libraries are key. And so there's a conclusion that you can draw there, which is not only is NPM's success and NPM's popularity being driven by the popularity of JavaScript, but that's a two-way street. There are 820,000 libraries in the NPM registry these days, and that gigantic gravitational well of libraries is also driving the popularity of JavaScript itself. And that is important for your company because the explosion of popularity of NPM is the result of easy code reuse. It's the result of these loose contracts that don't require a meeting, that mean that you can get code, you can reuse code without having to beg somebody if it's okay, and you don't have to release all of your applications in lockstep. This is what made NPM so popular to use and so easy to use. And you can recreate that same exponential curve of reuse inside your organization. And reusing code is obviously fantastic. If 97% of your code comes from NPM, that means you did way less work than you would otherwise have done. It means you have higher quality software than you otherwise would have. It means that a lot of other people have eyeballs on that code and they've found the bugs for you. It means you can hire people who already know how most of your application works, right? That is the magic of a framework, is you just hire a React developer, and they already know how your application works. It's great. But it's not without downsides. You train your developers in security best practices. Well, I hope you do. You do code reviews and you do audits. Again, I hope you do. And all of it only applies to, like I said, the last 3% of your code. The other 97% of your code is being downloaded straight from our servers, often with no checks whatsoever. Malicious code on NPM is actually surprisingly rare. Most people's threat model for NPM is, what if I download the wrong package and it turns out to be evil? But that hardly ever happens because there's 10 million developers, and the social incentives and the social signals from that are really, really strong. That hardly ever happens, but what does happen all the time is accidentally vulnerable code. Code where the developer has already found a vulnerability, already fixed the vulnerability, has told everybody that they need to upgrade, but people are still pulling in the older versions of the software because they haven't heard about the upgrade. Earlier this year, NPM started automatically auditing all NPM installs for those sorts of vulnerabilities, as well as for malicious packages. And we started delivering the results to developers via the command line. We now do more than 4 million scans a week, and the stats are not good. 51% of all of the installs that we track had some kind of vulnerability in them. Some of those are very minor, but 11% of them were critical vulnerabilities. Those are break the glass, huge red button, do not ship the product vulnerabilities in the install, and it was 11%. And we can see our server logs, and a lot of those installs are going to financial institutions. It makes me very nervous. But the good news is that we can help you get those numbers down. NPM's audit functionality, it doesn't just tell you that there are vulnerabilities in your code. It doesn't just sort of make you amorphously nervous, which is what a lot of security products are sort of designed to do. It can actually help you fix the vulnerability, because what NPM audit does is it gives you advice about how to remedy the problem, and it's usually you just need to run npm update to pull in a newer version of the dependency. So if npm is telling you to run npm, why doesn't npm just do that? That is what npm audit fix does. npm audit fix follows its own advice and upgrades your software for you automatically. We have not solved the halting problem. It does not repair software for you, but it does take an enormous amount of work out of keeping your software up to date, especially when the average JavaScript project has something like 1,000 modules in it these days. This is a big leap forward in terms of JavaScript security, and we are already beginning to see some improvements in the number of vulnerable packages as a result. External security through npm audit is great, but you also need to lock down internal access. You need to have a threat model that includes internal changes and internal actors. So you need your security to be airtight, but you also need it not to present a barrier to your workflows, because if you put barriers in front of web developers are clever and they will find a way around the barrier, and that is worse than no security, because you think you have security, but you don't. And finally, there's compliance, which is always a top concern for financial institutions. Compliance was easy when the answer was we use jQuery, because you knew what the license was for jQuery. You could put a page in your document about it and you were done. But now you are using 1,000 modules from 1,000 people you've never met, and doing compliance on 1,000 modules when you change them all the time is a compliance nightmare, honestly. And the good news is we can help you with that as well. I mentioned just now that security that devs work around is worse than no security. The same can happen with compliance. We've met with more than one major financial institution and have seen compliance policies in place that either ban open source JavaScript entirely, or put heavyweight processes in place that require that you individually apply to use each one of the modules that you are using. This is an absurd policy for a world in which people are using 1,000 or 1,500 modules in an application. And that means that it doesn't get followed. It doesn't mean that people are like, okay, we won't use JavaScript, because you can't not use JavaScript. You have to use JavaScript. So instead what happens is people use the JavaScript anyway, but they just don't tell anybody. This, when I started discovering that this was not just like an isolated thing happening at one financial company, but like a pattern across multiple very large multinational financial companies, I became very nervous, because you have my money as well. you can't just hope nobody notices you're using JavaScript. We're going to find out that you're using JavaScript, and the way that we're going to find out is because you're going to get hacked because you were running insecure JavaScript. There are real risks here that need to be taken seriously, and while these risks are absolutely worth the enormous benefits of all of this code reuse, you have to manage those risks. So what all of this comes down to is you have to professionalize the way you use JavaScript. So what is stopping us doing that if it seems like such a good idea? And the answer, especially in finance, especially at large companies, is usually fear. Fear of exposure, fear of risk, but even more often, fear of being slowed down by inflexible IT policies or compliance costs. Even at small companies, the fear that security will slow you down leads to unacceptable risks being taken with JavaScript. So our solution to how to professionalize JavaScript is called NPM Enterprise. We are the world's experts in shipping JavaScript quickly and securely, and we built the best tool available to help you do that. We listened really carefully to the needs of enterprise customers, and we've built a tool that will genuinely help you ship faster and foster collaboration inside of your company, the things that your developers want, and also keep your JavaScript more secure than any other tool that exists, which is what your IT department wants. It's one of those very rare situations where those two groups of people can get together and say, yes, we both want the same product right now. So it checks every box. That's what it's for, right? It lets you use NPM like NPM, the NPM that you're used to, while simultaneously checking all of the boxes, the security questionnaire that the IT department has. So it just feels like NPM, which your developers are going to love because your developers are going to use NPM whether they tell you or not. NPM Enterprise gives you your own private registry on your own private domain that you can lock down to your network. You get your own NPM website, with full search of public packages and full search of your own private packages. You can search not just package names, but also the readmes. And it's just like the real NPM. And it also ships with support for NPM audit and audit fix. Every install is going to be audited, and that data is going to be available to you. In addition to the public vulnerabilities, NPM Enterprise customers also get embargoed vulnerabilities that our systems and researchers have discovered up to 30 days before they are publicly disclosed. So that gives you time to fix things at leisure. And finally, NPM Enterprise has fine-grained access control. You can create scopes and organizations for individual units in your business so people who are fighting do not have to fight for the same space. And you can create different teams that have different publish and install access rights for people who don't want to be able to trample on each other's work. You can use your existing single sign-on solution within your corporate environment, whatever it happens to be, and you can use it from the command line. There's no other tool that lets you use your single sign-on to log in from the NPM command line other than NPM Enterprise. Speaking of other solutions, sometimes we hear often from financial companies is, oh, we already have a thing that does that. And I'm here to tell you that unless you are already using this thing, you do not already have a thing that does that. I know that Java and JavaScript have similar names, but if you are using a tool from Javaland to manage your JavaScript, it is like using a hammer instead of a screwdriver because both nails and screws are kind of pointy. NPM Enterprise has a long list of features, and I'm not going to go into all of them, especially since you've all been sitting here so patiently for so long. But the important thing is this software satisfies the two goals that I laid out. It lets you ship faster, and it lets you ship more safely, and it helps you actually achieve compliance rather than just pretending that you did by sticking your fingers in your ears and going la 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 la. Obviously, it's a huge surprise that a company called NPM would recommend a product called NPM. But there is a reason that it is good, and the reason is because we focus on JavaScript. We are not trying to be all things to all people. We are not trying to build a tool that also does Python and Ruby and everything else. We picked what we decided was the most important language and what all of the data tells us is the most important language, and we doubled down on building the best possible tool for that language. Because it really is a surprise that JavaScript became the most important programming language in the world, so it's time that enterprises focus on it. So if you think that we can help you out with that, myself and my colleague Jake, who is there, we are going to be at our booth all of this evening, and you can contact us here, or you can come and talk to us in person. And thank you all very much for your attention.